passage this morning is Psalm number 87. Psalm number 87, it's found on page 596 in the Church Bible, and we're going to read this whole psalm. Of the sons of Korah, a psalm, a song. He has set his foundation on the holy mountain. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are said of you, O city of God. Selah. I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me. Philistia too, and Tyre along with Cush, and will say, this one was born in Zion. Indeed, of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself will establish her. The Lord will write in the register of the peoples, this one was born in Zion. Selah. As they make music, they will sing. All my fountains are in you. I want to start off this morning with a question. Where is the greatest city in the whole world? If you were to ask, say, 100 people that question, I suspect you'd get a lot of different answers. Some people might think of Rome and the history of that city. Some people might think of Paris and the art and the culture. Other people might think of New York and the buzz of that big city. It's a question that is absolutely impossible to answer. And yet, that is exactly what God does in Psalm 87. God tells us here there is one city that is head and shoulders above all of the rest. One city that is completely unlike any other. One city that we are to get excited about. And this morning we want to see what Psalm 87 has to say about that city. Now we're going to see two things, and the first thing we see is the glory of the city. The glory of the city. Now God doesn't leave us to guess where this city is. It's Zion. And Zion, by the way, is just another name for Jerusalem. We're told the Lord loves the gates of Zion. He loves it more than anywhere else. And I think we have to acknowledge that there's something about that just doesn't make a lot of sense. Imagine you lived several thousand years ago whenever this psalm was being written, and imagine that your job was to write a travel guide. Your job was to come up with a list of different cities that you must visit before you die. Well, I think it's fair to say that Jerusalem wouldn't necessarily be your top choice. There were cities that were bigger than Jerusalem. There were cities that had been around for a lot longer, and there were cities that were far more prosperous. And yet, of all of the cities in the world, God picks out Jerusalem. Why? Well, the answer is in verse 1. There is something that is fundamentally different about this city. Who is the founder? It's God himself. Verse 1. He has set his foundation on the holy mountain. Jerusalem may not be the biggest or the most prestigious city in the world, but of all of the cities in the world, Jerusalem is the one that God has established. Jerusalem is the one that God has appointed to be his special place on earth. And as you read through the Old Testament, you see just how special it is. Let's say you wanted to find out more about God. Where would you go? You'd go to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is where many of the prophets were preaching. If you wanted to express your devotion to God by offering sacrifices, where would you go? You'd go to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is where the temple was. If you wanted to see God's chosen king, or if you wanted to experience fellowship with God's chosen people, you went to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the epicenter of God's kingdom on earth. It is the one place in all of the world where God had promised that he would dwell with his people in a special way. And that's why every year the pilgrims would make this really long journey in order to get there. We began our service this morning by singing from Psalm 122. That psalm would have been sung by the pilgrims as they made their way to Jerusalem. This city was so special, and so you can imagine the pilgrims as they're walking towards Jerusalem, as they make that long journey. You can imagine how excited they would have been as they caught their first glimpse of the city walls. They were coming to the most glorious place on earth. Jerusalem is the greatest city in the world. So, what am I saying? Once this COVID-19 pandemic is over, should we just turn on our computers or go to the travel agent and book flights to Jerusalem? Well, no, I'm not saying that. You see, not only does the Old Testament show us the glory of Jerusalem, it also shows us that Jerusalem is a picture of something better. It shows us that God was never meant to be simply for the Jews and for nowhere else. It shows us that God was never meant to be worshipped in the temple and nowhere else. It shows us that right from the very start, God had a vision for the whole world. And we see that vision starting to blossom as we go through the Old Testament, but we see the vision then blossoming into full maturity in the New Testament. We see in the New Testament, not only does God work out his purposes in the nation of Israel, he works them out in the true Israel, the spiritual Israel, the Church of Jesus Christ. And that means very often whenever we sing about Jerusalem or whenever we read about Jerusalem in the Old Testament, we're actually singing and we're reading about something even better. We're singing about the church. And God's saying to us in this psalm, the church is glorious. The church is the most wonderful thing in all of the world. God is saying to us here, you don't need to buy a travel magazine to find out where the must-visit place is. God is saying to us, you're already there. He's saying this morning, as you gather in this car park, you are in the epicenter of my work and my blessing on earth. That's surprising, isn't it? The church is not the most impressive organisation in the world. It's not the richest, it's not the glitziest organisation in the world. It's incredibly ordinary, isn't it? It's not full of great people. It's full of ordinary people. People like you and me. Sinful people. Weak people. And yet, God loves the church more than anything else in all of the world. God loves the church enough to send his own son to die for it. The church is glorious. And that's one of the reasons why today is such a joyful day. Yes, here we are, we're in a car park. This is not at all how we imagined we would be doing things, but here we are, and we're gathered in the greatest city in the world. And let me encourage you this morning, allow the sheer glory of where we are and what we're doing this morning to outweigh the awkwardness of meeting in cars in the middle of a car park. Let me encourage you, as we go forward and as the novelty of being back gathered together wears off, allow the glory of the city to impact your commitment to the city. Allow the splendour of what we're doing here this morning to impact your commitment to being at worship. Allow the glory of the city to be obvious in the way that you speak about this congregation with your friends. Allow it to change the way you pray. Allow it to change the way you give. Let me ask you this morning, do you glory in the church? Do you value the church more than anything else in all of the earth? Because God does. And surely if God does, then we should too. The first thing we see this morning is the glory of the city. The second thing we see this morning is the citizens of the city. The citizens of the city. I've been to New York City once in my life. It was around about 8 years ago, and one of the things that I most distinctly remember about walking around in that city was the sheer number of different languages that I was able to hear. And some of the languages I was able to at least work out what language they were, but many of the languages I had no idea. I read recently that apparently, I don't know if this is true or not, but apparently there are something like 800 different languages spoken in that one city. It is incredibly diverse. But New York City is not the most diverse city in the whole world. Jerusalem is. Now, not, of course, the literal city in the Middle East. I mean the real Jerusalem, the spiritual Jerusalem. I mean the church of Jesus Christ. And in this psalm, God is making it crystal clear that his gospel and his love are not simply for people who were born and bred in one particular place. He's telling us here his love goes so much further. And God demonstrates that by listing a series of different names. Now, the best way to understand what God is saying here is to imagine that you live in Israel thousands of years ago when this psalm was written, and imagine that you're looking at a map. Now, we've got 5 names. We've got Rahab, Babylon, Philistia, Tyre, and Cush. First of all, we've got Rahab. Now, don't get confused. This is not the lady who lived in Jericho. Rather, this is a nickname for Egypt. And Egypt, if you're looking at your map, that's to the south, well, the southwest really, of Israel. Then there's Babylon. Of course, we've been looking at Babylon in our evening services in Daniel, haven't we? But Babylon is modern day Iraq. And if you're looking at your map, that is off to the east of Israel. Then there's Philistia, the Philistines. Philistines, of course, they live on the western coast. And then there's Tyre. Tyre was part of the Phoenician Empire. Today, that is Lebanon. It's to the north of Israel. And whenever you look at your map, what do you see? You see we've got north, south, east, and west. Every single direction is covered in this psalm. And then we have a 5th name, Cush. And roughly speaking, Cush is modern day Ethiopia. Basically, it's as far as you can possibly go in those days without leaving the known world. At home, I have got a replica of a very, very old map. This map was drawn several hundred years after this psalm was written, and Cush is right at the very edge, and there's nothing beyond Cush on the map, because everything that is further south than Cush is unknown. A bit like how we might say today, we might talk about Timbuktu. It's as far as you can possibly go. Well, what do we have here? We've got a summary of the nations of the earth. We've got Tyre in the north, we've got Egypt in the south, Babylon in the east, Philistia in the west, and then to top it all off, we've got Cush, the farthest corner of the world that you can possibly imagine. Why does God tell us these names? Surely he wants us to have a global vision for the Church of Jesus Christ. Yes, we're a small congregation. There aren't many of us here today, but we are part of something that is absolutely enormous. God wants us to have a global vision. But there's more to it than just that. You see, you can't read very far in the Old Testament without bumping into these names again and again. Egypt was a wicked nation. Egypt is the nation that enslaved Israel. It tried to have the baby boys drowned in the Nile. The Philistines, they were the people of Goliath. We've seen them several times in 1 Samuel. They were always pillaging, always raiding, always being a thorn in Israel's side. Babylon, of course, we've seen them in the evening services. They're the nation that destroyed Jerusalem. They're the nation that desecrated the temple. They took God's people into exile. And their king had Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace. It's an evil nation. What do all of these people have in common? They are enemies. They are wicked. Well, we're living thousands of years later. Many of these names don't mean a great deal to us. But what if we were to translate these names into people that mean more to us today? Maybe we might talk about Nazis and communists and ISIS, the sorts of names that send a shiver down your spine. And what is it in this psalm that God says about these people? They will make their home in the greatest city in the world. They will come to the centre of God's worship. They will live as God's subjects. And we can only understand such a stupendous, such a staggering statement if we realise it's pointing us forward to the New Testament. It's pointing us forward to the Church of Jesus Christ. Is that not something we saw in Acts chapter 2, the passage that we read earlier? We see people from this huge, enormous big list of nations, and they're brought into the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Is that not something that we see today? Our denomination has got sister churches in France and Cyprus and Australia and Japan and South Sudan and in many other countries. Some of us know missionaries, or we get missionary prayer points from Africa and from India and from South America. The church is gloriously diverse. And the diversity of the church points us to the glorious, incredible saving grace of Jesus Christ. The church is not simply made up of the usual suspects. There are people in the church today that you would never ever expect to follow Jesus Christ. Jihadist fighters who have turned their backs on Islam and have followed Jesus. Criminals who have found Jesus after many, many years of crime. Idol worshippers, both literal idol worshippers and metaphorical idol worshippers, who have had their eyes opened and have seen that there is only one true God. That is part of the glory of the Church of Christ. The church is full of all sorts of different people with all sorts of different stories. And you could go to any congregation, hopefully at least, and you can find a Christian in one seat who can't remember a time before he came to church. He grew up singing the Psalms. He grew up learning his Sunday school lessons. And you can find a Christian in the next seat who is brand new to the faith. Someone who has spent most of his life far, far away from God. And yet, by the grace of Jesus Christ, they are both in the church. The diversity of the church is a wonderful thing. And it gets better. Because notice what God says about these people. He doesn't say they've immigrated here. He doesn't say they've moved here. No, he says this one and that one was born in Zion. I don't know if any of you have followed the news from Australia over the last number of years. Maybe not, but there was a number of years ago a political crisis in that country. And the problem is that the Constitution of Australia forbids anybody who is a citizen of another country from running for public office. And that created a crisis because it turned out that quite a number of the members of the Australian Parliament, without even knowing it, were technically dual citizens of other countries. Some of them were born abroad and they moved to Australia whenever they were young. Some of them were actually born in Australia, but their parents originally came from overseas. In fact, there was one man, and he found out he was technically a dual citizen of Italy. And he didn't know it. He had never even been to Italy, but this was technically the case. And suddenly, all of the members of the Australian Parliament were in the spotlight. People from other parties would be digging into their past, digging into their ancestry. Basically, the question that people were asking is who is really Australian and who is technically a foreigner. And notice, in this psalm, when it comes to citizens of God's great city, there's none of that. There's no digging into the past. There's no such thing as a second-class citizen. There's no skeletons in the closet that's going to exclude someone from being a citizen of the city. Everybody, whether they were born and bred in Jerusalem or whether they came from one of these hostile nations, everybody who swears allegiance to the one true God is counted as a natural-born citizen. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Whether you have been a Christian for decades or for days, whether you have a clean past or a wild past, if you are following Jesus Christ, you're a citizen, pure and simple. There is no such thing as a second-class member of the church. Isn't that something that should make us so thankful? If there's one news story that has dominated the airwaves over the last number of months, apart from COVID, it's racism, isn't it? What is the solution to that horrific sin? It's the gospel of Jesus Christ, isn't it? A message that says, in the kingdom of Christ, there is no such thing as black and white or native and immigrant. There are just citizens. Is that not something that should make us thankful as we think of ourselves? Perhaps you have skeletons in your closet. Perhaps you were very, very far from Jesus for a very long time. And yet, now that you have been saved by the grace of Christ, you don't live in this city on some sort of visa scheme. You're a citizen, just like everybody else. It's something as well that should keep us humble, isn't it? Perhaps you grew up in the church. Perhaps you grew up going to Sunday school and learning Sunday school lessons. But this psalm tells you, you are no more deserving of your place in the city than anybody else. By nature, we're all enemies of God, aren't we? By nature, we are all rebels. And yet what does God say about us in this psalm? We are natural-born citizens of Zion. Isn't this something that should encourage us as we think about outreach? So many of the people that we live among and we work with are far, far from Christ. There are so many people we know, and we cannot possibly imagine them wanting anything to do with the gospel. Well, it's hard to imagine someone from Babylon wanting anything to do with Jerusalem. But God, in His grace, draws them in. And this psalm is telling us there is no one, not your neighbours, not your colleagues, not your friends, not your family members who are so resistant to the gospel. There is no one who is resistant to the grace of Jesus Christ. This psalm shows us God draws even the most unlikely of people into his kingdom. And so we mustn't lose heart as we think about those whom we love.